So, one of the thoughts that we had in putting this together was a lot has happened in the last year, and there's a lot of progress to put out in front of you. And most of you who are actually directors, managers of different environmental organizations don't need this fundamental starting point. But when there was a conversation in Corte Madera about a climate action plan, our town council was a little reluctant at first, weakened it a little bit, and there wasn't unanimity about having it. So I thought, well, let's go through some of these facts and talk about the way that facts get presented and dealt with. And just sticking with facts, some of you are very avid observers of species and their migration patterns, both flora and fauna, and you know that those patterns are changing. Some trees are drying up and gaining bark beetles. Other butterflies and birds are migrating into places that they haven't been before. You know that better than anybody. We just experienced a 1,000-year drought and unprecedented wildfires. Yes, some wildflowers follow wildfires. Wildfires in California and throughout the Northwest, as well, ironically, as deep floods in the center of the country down through Texas. There's increased moisture and in the air and power in storms over warming oceans. Those oceans that are rising are increasingly acidic. Reefs are bleaching. Patterns of fish and mammals in the sea are changing. There is a very specific amount of melting of land-based glaciers, which is actually quite concerning. And more on that later. More on each of these points, actually covered in greater depth by other speakers. But NOAA, over the years, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration has been measuring 36 glaciers on land. And those dark bars are the absolute loss of ice. The red is the cumulative disappearance of water that had been locked into fresh glacier mass through recently. Global sea level rise has been measured in millimeters, and if you don't believe it, ask the 21 mayors from two parties who a couple of weeks ago adopted this little statement as they were begging the presidential candidates to actually talk about sea level rise, because they're having sunny day water come up through the storm sewers in parts of the Miami area, and they're having salty water come in through the otherwise once upon a time freshwater reserves underneath. This week, the Citizens Climate Lobby has actually made public a paper that is by Dr. James Hansen. You recognize that name. He's the first one to, 25 years ago, put in front of Congress the fact that global warming was coming. And he has actually left his position in the government so that he could become a more vigorous advocate. He and 14 other scientists have just published a paper which says, guess what? The sea level rise is even worse than was represented a month ago by the last forum's session on sea level rise. And we could be looking at 2-3 meters, which would in fact put 40% of Corte Madera underwater by the end of this century. I put all of this up there so that if anybody wants to look into it, because this will be an important part of the news going forward, I promise you, and that's the place where it was published, and this is the name of the article. Now, the folks at NOAA have also been doing a recording of the average global temperature, both over water and land. 2014 was the warmest year in recorded history, only exceeded by 2015. And the two places that are colder than usual are actually thought to be colder in part because of the melt off of Greenland and off of western Antarctica, which will cause other aspects of problems that are deeply covered in Dr. Hansen's recent paper. So how has this been communicated? And how is it that some presidential candidates can get up and with a serious face say, the data show that the temperatures haven't been rising? Well, some say that they haven't been rising. Well, how can they do that? Well, if you take 1998 as the starting point, which was, up until that time, the warmest year in recorded history by quite a bit. And you draw that line forward till about 2012, you can say, well, my goodness, it's not just level, it's actually averaging down. If you only take that data point and ignore everything else. So there is some little toehold of truth behind this misrepresentation of the true situation, which is the true line, which averages up through to and particularly if you incorporate the last 2 years, which have been unprecedentedly warm, and even more particularly if you go and look at, I'm going to go forward one, look at the entire history of human recorded temperatures and watch that pattern as it goes up. But guess what, folks? Guess what 2016 is doing? The first 2 months of this year have been the warmest recorded January and February, and the difference between January and February is a greater positive difference than has ever happened before in the pattern of recording these records. Are we in trouble? This is the big picture, and you shouldn't look at any one month as the answer or the cause or the whole truth. Look at the whole thing. The oceans have been warming in measurable ways, and this is since 1993. So, what's the cause? How do we attribute this to human behavior? To look at the cause, I would say you should talk to a skeptic. You should talk to someone who doesn't completely agree. And up until a couple of years ago, Dr. Richard Mueller from Berkeley was one of the stalwart, I'm holding back, I've got different ways to interpret the data, I'm looking at this differently, until he and his daughter really started to dig in and say, well, what correlates most? And they have looked at everything. They've looked at sunspots, they looked at volcanoes, they've looked at the changing magnetic north pattern. They looked at a lot of different variables, as well as CO2 increases, which clearly do come from human activity. And what did he find? Well, he found enough so that he published a paper in the New York Times called "The Conversion of a Climate Change Skeptic." And his key phrase, the salient phrase in the whole thing is, how definite is the attribution of temperature rise to humans? The carbon dioxide curve gives a better match than anything else that we have studied and seen. The trend is steady and relentless. Yes, it changes seasonally, no question about it. But the overall trend is definite and cumulative. And when you go through the ice records back 800,000 years, you look at a cyclical pattern that has occurred, but never has it been ahead of the level that we achieved in about 1950, and certainly not the level that we are seeing now of over 400 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere. So, in advance of Paris, in advance of COP21, is there anybody here who doesn't know what COP21 is? The Council of Parties 21st meeting, the 21st time that the UN got together and discussed this. The scientists that were responsible for pulling together all the papers and putting out the information that would be looked at by the leaders of the world, who all gathered in Paris. And this was the fundamental conclusion. CO2 concentrations haven't been this high in millions of years. Even more alarming is the rate of increase. Remember that last slide that I showed you? When you compress the time, it compresses it into a virtually vertical line. Climate change is a threat to life on Earth, and we can no longer afford to be spectators. So we need some big solutions. Is dealing with energy generation and the way we produce fossil fuels enough? As a solar energy professional, I'd love to say, oh yes, we're very important. Well, I'm afraid we're not. It's not enough. We also have to look at transportation. We have a couple of people who are going to make a deeper point on that a little bit later. So what does renewable energy do? Well, There's no GHG, so there's environmental benefits. There are health benefits of having cleaner air. What if we all go to all this work and clean up the air and climate change isn't a thing? Well, we've still made our health better, so what's the problem with that? There's less risk in renewable energy products. Have you ever heard of a solar spill? You know what a solar spill is? Sunny? Good. Have you ever heard of a wind war? There is great news in renewable energy jobs and the economy, which we're going to cover a little bit more. And renewable energy really does get us to security, energy independence, and local control, because we can distribute the sources of energy right where it's used. So what's not to like? But is it enough? That's the question. And others will get into that more deeply. So what's the case for solar? It's pretty well established. I got into it 8 years ago because I could see that not only is it clean and quiet, easy to build, no moving parts, it performs and has reliable output. The major manufacturers have 25-year warranties, so you know it's going to live for 30 years. It doesn't take long to build, they last for long, and there's no fuel cost or risk. So it's a great case. What are the downsides of solar? Other than that, it does take up a lot of surface area in order to generate energy. That is a bad feature of solar for now. But bird deaths, some people say, well, there's bird deaths that occur from solar. Annually, there are between 400 and 900 million deaths from glass on buildings, from houses to high rises. And yes, energy sources are a risk to birds. And this analysis, which was put together by a number of different people, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and reported by U.S. News and World Report, says coal, directly and indirectly, almost 8 million birds a year from coal. Between 500,000 and 1 million birds a year from oil and gas. 330,000 from the heat, primarily of nuclear. And yes, particularly older wind has a problem with birds. Older, smaller, faster turning windmills. The newer, more efficient windmills, not an issue. Solar, yes, some bird deaths have been discovered in one report where there was thin film, black surface in the desert near some black surface ponds that were nearby, and waterfowl tried to land on those panels because they misinterpreted those black panels as if it was water nearby. And the high estimate comes from those who are concerned about solar thermal. Has anybody seen the models of Ivanpah, where there are thousands of mirrors that surround a heat tower, and all of those turn with the sun and heat the tower to 750 degrees. If a bird gets in the way, yeah, it's going to be fried, I'm sorry. And there are bird deaths as a result of that kind of solar. It's not solar PV, it is solar thermal. It's a totally different technology. And it's also the high estimate from those who are opposed to that kind of solar. The regular kind of solar, minuscule compared to all of the others. And so what's the real problem with solar? The real problem with solar is that it's intermittent. This slide is not coming out very well. I think the beautiful parabola of sunshine in the middle isn't showing up. But the typical, certainly home use of energy, you wake up in the morning and you turn on the toaster and you dry your hair and you get ready for work and you disappear in the middle of the day. The demand for energy is not great in your own home. And it goes up when you come home and start making dinner and people start turning on their computers and whatnot in the evening. And solar is only busy during those light green moments to help directly with that. This slide, by the way, was prepared by a German company called Sonnen Battery, which is producing tens of thousands of batteries that are in use in the United States already, teamed up with solar. This is a very complicated topic that sums up, if you are the administrator of the grid, and this was put together by the administrators of the California grid, you are going to have, you're going to be very familiar with the duck curve. How many people have heard of the duck curve before? A few. So what you're looking at here is in the middle of the night, the need for energy is going down. And in the early years, before solar gets very, very productive in California, you have a need for more energy in the middle of the day with offices and air conditioning and so forth, and then you have that evening peak. The more solar you add, the less traditional energy is needed in the California system until predicting into the future when we have 1/3 of our sources are supposed to be renewable by 2020. And so it creates the deep belly of the duck. Still, big need for increasing the amount of generation in the evening. That isn't solved by solar alone. So you need something else. Now, jobs, yes, over 200,000 jobs last year. Very fast growth. Is renewable energy a job killer, as some folks are saying? No. Solar has grown 12 times faster than the overall workforce. It employs now more than 3 times the number of people employed in coal extraction. And even the Cal ISO, this is the headquarters of the independent system operator that controls the flows in California, who's worried about the duck curve, that put solar on their property, thanks to the company that I used to work for. And one of the things to recognize about the increase in jobs is that all of those are installed jobs that cannot possibly be sent overseas because it's installed right here. And many of the others can't either. Comparing what the utilities have, so this is the top 5 utilities in the state, a little under 50,000 jobs in the top 5 utilities, all summed up, about a quarter of which are producing green energy. And solar has 75,000, 100% of which are green. So where has solar come? This is in the United States. Look at that curve. This is actually really great news if you're a fan of seeing the substitution of GHGs out. Between 2010 and 2015, just in that 5-year period, well, there's 8 times more solar installed. And more solar got installed last year in terms of new additions to the generating pattern than gas. First time in history. And also worth to note, the segmentation. The light blue is utility scale. The dark blue is residential scale. The medium blue is that commercial scale, schools, municipalities, and so forth that I work in. So how are we doing as a country? Elena's got some great slides that deal with this better, but overall, this is the mix. We have actually been very efficient in the United States, and we've been using less electricity generation. We haven't been using less gasoline, but we've been using less electricity generation. And yes, indeed, the amount of generation by coal has been shrinking. The amount of generation by renewables is up. Coal has gone from 40% to about 30%, shrinking. Gas is growing, and growing still, because it's cheap. Hydro used to be very steady until we have droughts. Then hydro isn't quite so useful anymore when we have deep droughts. So still, 2/3 of the U.S. generation is fossil fuels. So we still have a very big problem in terms of GHGs. Interesting question, which Jackson is going to address a little bit later. If we close more of our nuclear power plants, which currently generate about 19% of our energy, of our electricity each year, what will replace that steady 24/7 generation power? I'm going to skip that one. And what's wrong with natural gas? Safe, clean natural gas. Think about it. Particularly what the risks are. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. If you have any doubts about that, ask the thousands of people who relocated thanks to the disaster at Porter Ranch. Now, regulatorily, and I'm going over, and I got to stop this very quickly, but in the United States, we do not have a single energy policy. Nothing like it. In fact, 60% of our states only have actual standards, renewable portfolio standards. Another 8 have goals, and the rest don't have any. Who's ahead? Who's in the competition? Well, Vermont has got a 75% renewables by 2032. They're in the lead in terms of timing, but a few of us are close behind. California just adopted last year SB 350, which sets by 2030 50% renewable goal. Hawaii has a 100% renewable goal by 2045, so we put it out a little bit. And just in the last 2 weeks, Oregon passed a new law that said they're going to push up and match California, 50%. But guys, we still have 13 states that have no standard, none.